Welcome to The Hill's Coronavirus Report. I'm Steve Clemons, editor-at-large of The Hill. Each day we are interviewing consequential leaders and innovators in the battle against the coronavirus. 3 months ago, the United States had 0 deaths related to COVID-19, and now today we are sadly at the threshold of 100,000 dead in this country. How did we get here? What were the warnings? What is the purpose of a $1 trillion national security establishment if it can't protect Americans on their own home turf? What will accountability look like in the years ahead as we try to reorganize our health security and national security decision-making and infrastructure to prepare for future pandemics? Gregory Treverton chaired the U.S. National Intelligence Council from 2014 to January 2017. And in my way of looking at it, this is, for lay people, really the CIA's council of the best and brightest advising the President of the United States. He is now professor of the practice of international relations and spatial sciences at the University of Southern California and chairman of the Global Technopolitics Forum. And Gregory joins me now from Skype from Los Angeles. Greg, thank you so much for joining us here and sharing this. I know you've thought a lot about the various forms of national security threats that face the United States. Let's just start there. When you were basically the CIA's chief organizer of threats, where was pandemics on your list of possible problems for us?
It's been on the list for a very long time, I think. And I remember before I was in the government, when I was out of government, running a center at the Rand Corporation, and this was early 2000s, we ranked threats to the United States as nuisance, serious, or existential. And the only threat in the existential category was pandemics. My predecessors at the National Intelligence Council, in their 2004 report, Global Trends, they painted almost exactly the scenario we're in, unfortunately, with globalization reversing, global travel stopping, huge economic hits. So strategically, in terms of strategic warning, this has been on our list for a very long time. The problem is it hasn't always been as salient as it should have been. We have an episode and then we kind of forget it. And then we've gone back to business as usual several times, even after SARS, even after 12,000 people died in 2001 from H1N1.
Well, one of the things that struck me as I've interviewed on this report, people like former Senate Majority Leader Bill Frist, Senator Chris Coons, who's in office now, and whether it was Democrat or Republican, many people saw this thing coming. If so many, you talk about salience as one element of it, but really the leadership of both political parties saw something like this coming. Why did we fail when so many smart people across both parties? What was the real reason for the breakdown in preparing for this?
It goes way back, I think. It has, as always, there are so many causes that are intertwined. Plainly, we haven't been investing in public health in general. Budgets of CDC and FDA have been going down, not up. But we've had these previous episodes, and then we tended to say, well, now we're through that, and we'll go back to business as usual, not recognizing that this is something that's going to be continually there and that we ought to be prepared for. So the infrastructure wasn't really there. And then we got this combination of the Chinese dissembling, hiding, so we lost time there. But even when we got warning in mid-January, we should have known that if there was something going on in China, it was going to be here, right? We knew globalization was going to bring it here. And at that point, we really should have done what the Germans did, begun stockpiling tests and preparing, but we didn't. And that, I think, a lot of that probably does lie at Mr. Trump's door, since he continued to say, nothing much here, no big deal, be over quickly. But there was also, it seems to me, challenges for the bureaucracy. The CDC and FDA look a little bit to me like the FBI and the CIA before 9/11, not really cooperating as closely as they needed to, and maybe a little bit overconfident, thinking, well, we can handle this. Well, it turns out they couldn't.
Well, to that point, I recently interviewed the CDC's director, Robert Redfield, and he took my calendar back even further, saying at the end of December, they had begun to organize their first internal meetings. And then by January 2nd, they had actually fully informed the National Security Council, which is even a bit earlier than I had thought had occurred before. But I think in early questions about testing and what methodology to come down to, I agree with you that there would seem to be a dysfunction or a lack of coordination between the FDA and the CDC on how to proceed. And so, we can sit and study everything that went wrong now, but I think the big question is, what do we do for the future, and how do we look at that decision-making and action behavior that we saw from various parts and move forward? And in the pages of The Hill, you made a suggestion. So what did you suggest?
Well, it seems to me that first we need to have a thorough investigation, I think, and really lay out all the facts. And something like the 9/11 panel, that seems to me inevitable and a good thing to do. The big questions for me there are, do you want to try and do the usual bureaucratic solution? As after 9/11, we created the Department of Homeland Security. Do we want to create a Department of Health Security? I'm not sure that's the best idea, but that's certainly going to be on the agenda, I would think. At least I hope it's on the agenda, because this is, in terms of needless loss of American lives, this I think is going to rank as the biggest government failure in the history of the Republic. Now, you can talk about 1918, but in 1918 we really didn't know what to do. This time around we knew what to do, we just didn't do it. So I think the first instinct will be, do we need to create some special government agency? The real challenge is making the interface between public and private work better. And what didn't happen here was early enough I suppose being cautious when your commander-in-chief is saying no big deal, then people at CDC and FDA are not going to take risks. They're not going to circumvent procedures. They're not going to say, okay, labs, go ahead and start making these tests without prior permission. That just wasn't going to happen. So that's, to me, the critical challenge is working better across that public-private interface, since really all the capacity, or much of the capacity, once the labs were turned loose, they could do a lot, but they weren't turned loose and way late in the game. So that, I think, is the challenge that's going to get, I think, the attention is going to go to, should we create something different governmentally? And that may be part of the solution, but in general, it seems to me the real challenge is harnessing the private sector in ways that are predictable and useful and repeatable.
Were you surprised at the reports from states that they were having to compete against one another, sort of the law of the jungle, and trying to secure PPE equipment and testing equipment, and we're just in a no manner, that there just seemed to be an absence of direction and an absence of an organizing platform, and they were all just told to go out and do it on their own. And then as they were doing it on their own, we've also heard lots of cases of materials they had tried to secure being taken and hijacked, if you will, right, by the government for some sort of unknown calculus of distribution. And I just thinking of someone like you in intelligence and trying to orchestrate across agencies and departments, or someone that has been through crises before. I'm just interested in how Greg Treverton thought of all this.
I mean, it was a terrible spectacle to behold, right? Here's a time when you really want national leadership, right? This is the nation's problem. It's not individual states. And we had none, basically. We had this kind of free-for-all, as you described. Just amazing. Now, some of the state leaders, like my governor, like Andrew Cuomo, came through looking like real leaders. But they had to be. But what we really needed was a concerted, organized national plan. The problem there is who exactly should lead it. In that case, FEMA is not the strongest of government agencies. This is not something you can easily put the Pentagon on, but there needed to really be an organizing principle and a strategy. We didn't really have a strategy. As you say, that resulted in this incredible free-for-all with states competing for masks and PPE, and then, as you say, having FEMA hijack some of them for purposes we're not quite clear about. It was exactly a sort of textbook in how not to manage a crisis.
Now, you are respected on both sides of the aisle, Republicans and Democrats both, and the intelligence community for many years enjoyed a kind of beyond politics position. There are exceptions to that. Iraq, WMD issues, you can go back and find different moments where the intelligence community probably was not at its best. But overall, the bipartisanship and respect for that. how do you re-achieve that in going back and setting up the kind of commission you talked about? And do you have confidence that such a commission could be pursued, given what you see in the U.S. Senate today and what you see in the U.S. House today? Is that kind of step forward to kind of look back and then make smart organizational changes in the future possible?
I'm not sure. I mean, it is a terrible time, and so far the the pandemic seems to, if anything, sharpened, intensified our gridlock, not diluted it. So I am not optimistic. Now, the simple passage of time, who knows what's going to happen in November, but with simple passage of time, I hope that some of the shots that the intelligence community has taken will go down, will not persist, and that they'll continue to be looked at. This is an awkward one because pandemics are something obviously of interest to intelligence, but they are primarily a medical matter. And so part of the problem here may have been that we had a little bit of a gap between what the medical pieces of the government are doing and what the intelligence community is doing. We now know that the intelligence community was giving warnings, but those, obviously, since they were intelligence, weren't necessarily connected to anything operational. And so the challenge was not the warning, I think. The challenge was getting something to happen based on that warning. As I say, given the current state of our politics, it's not clear to me we will get a serious commission or serious thoughts about how to reorganize the government, if that makes sense, and how to, as I say, reach out to the private sector more systematically and more predictably.
You know, one of the things I respected about your work in the past and the National Intelligence Council is that you have to think out many, many moves ahead. And I know this will sound a lot of space age, perhaps crazy to some of my viewers, and I'm not one who subscribes to conspiracy theories, but there is now the behavior we've seen of how a virus can paralyze a society, paralyze a world. Some years ago, we had a gentleman, when I was at the Atlantic, we had a gentleman named Mark Goodman write a story for us. This was years ago, called Hacking the President, on how biogenetics and the ability to genetically modify pathogens could even attack an individual, that you could create that sort of condition. So you just talked about this demarcation between sort of the health sector and the national security side. Is it long overdue that we begin looking at the fact that no matter where this virus came from, and I should say most every legitimate person I know believes it evolved naturally, but it raises the question of, is this now something where people begin to try to look at copycat possibilities, and what will this do to our intelligence establishment as we begin to ponder those who might want to create these sort of pathogens?
I think biological threats have been high on everybody's list. They haven't gotten as much attention as other things like nuclear or terrorism, but I think they've been high on the intelligence community's list for a long, long time. We'd written in the past that one of the challenges is if something like this happened, you wouldn't immediately know whether it was a naturally occurring or accident or somebody doing it on purpose, and that'll continue to be true. It does seem to me that we need to think, as we rethink what to do after COVID, we really need to rethink what we mean by national security. You know, we're spending lots of money on the military, lots and lots of money on the military, and not very much on public health, but now we find that the biggest threat we've faced, probably in a very long time, is this, a pandemic, not an aggressive foe. So I think this should lead us, again, hard to imagine it happening in current political circumstances, but this really should lead us to rethink how we think about national security. And it does seem to me means that we need to try and do something about that gap between health and intelligence, recognizing that national security has a major health component to it, and both think and organize accordingly.
Greg, in our last minute or so, I would love to hear from you, and I'm going to put you on the spot. Are there any other blind spots to our national conversation or thinking about our security today that you think should be on the table? I mean, I think that's why you have intelligence, is to reveal blind spots. What are the blind spots that we're not considering as seriously as we should now?
I don't think they're great blind spots. We've been for so long so mesmerized by terrorism. I used to make audiences angry after 9/11 by saying that their chances of being killed by a terrorist were slightly less than being killed by lightning. But we did spend an awful lot of time and effort and money on terrorism. I think one of the things that was a blind spot has been a blind spot is biological issues, and particularly so naturally occurring. This wasn't exactly natural, may have been an accident, but it certainly was a bad thing happening, and apparently not a willful thing happening. But that was a major blind spot in our continuing thinking. We kept raising it, but we didn't really do anything to act on it. We actually drew down the reserves of PPE, protective equipment, not built them up. So it really did catch us by surprise when it shouldn't have.
Well, I want to thank Gregory Treverton for joining us today. Thanks so much for your insights into this. And I want to thank all of you. I'm Steve Clemons. We'll be back tomorrow. Be well.